Record on this computer. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our Sunday 1 o'clock town hall. And this week, I am wanting to talk about the Green New Deal. And I want to do a quick screen share and make sure everybody has seen this amazing series of photographs from Los Angeles. And so from December 2019 through March 21st, it's just an amazing visual of the lack of smog in LA while everything is shut down. And it's a really interesting phenomenon, like how quickly the atmosphere can actually recover from having a lot of stuff dropped into it. And so I wanted to just start out with that image today, which kind of is another way that it sort of ties together what we're working with here with, COVID-19 and ecological issues. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing at this point. And let's see. There we go. Get that up. All right, great. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your Sunday to join us for a conversation. I appreciate your time and your good attention. So the picture that I posted is really intended to sort of be a visual demonstration of business as usual versus our current state with the shutdown. And in geologic time, the speed with which our planetary systems are breaking down is also really fast. Like a picture like that gives us a sense of like how quickly they can recover. But in the really big scheme of things, we actually have some really disturbing planetary breakdowns happening right now. And in the United States, our per capita carbon emissions are some of the largest of anywhere in the world. And it's not simply because we drive a lot or consume a lot of stuff. Like, it's not just about individual choices, in spite of the kind of straw and plastic bag controversies that get, talked up on social media a lot. But also, and really first and foremost, because of the profit drive of our economic system. So climate disruption, which is my favored term for what we're experiencing, largely because when things break down, it's immediately deeply disrupting to our lives as usual. You can see how that disruption happens in situations like when Hurricane Katrina wiped out New Orleans, and that city is still really recovering, and the state of Puerto Rico, after getting repeatedly pummeled over the last year or so with superstorms. And so the disruption that we're experiencing right now because of COVID-19 is kind of a sobering foreshadowing of things to come as our ecological systems start to break down more. And in fact, there's some speculation that this might actually be an early version of climate disruption driven disease. And so, diseases like COVID-19 have been predicted by scientists to be more likely to increase in both number and severity, sort of like tornadoes. And as an example, as the climate changes, diseases that were once tropical have the opportunity to spread further. So we're seeing malaria in places that it wasn't 50 years ago. And Lyme disease is the fastest growing vector-borne illness in the United States. And what that means is that certain animals carry it, and we call them vectors. And as those animals have expanded territories, the diseases come with them. And, in the case of Lyme disease, that's ticks are now in places that we hadn't seen them before. And also, as ice melts with climate disruption, very old viruses that have been preserved in that ice are being released. And we don't really know what's going to happen once they reach human populations. But we do know that there is a definite relationship between climate disruption and disease spread. So the crisis that we're currently experiencing, I've been thinking of it as kind of like a pretty morbid dress rehearsal for climate disruption. And if you see these diseases in their proper scientific context, there may actually be a pretty direct relationship. And there's also pretty scary parallels between COVID-19 and climate disruption from a policy standpoint. So scientists were ignored and downplayed in both cases. A global pandemic has been long predicted, and here it is. And many countries were not heeding those warnings and putting in place what we needed in order to deal with it well once it actually arrived at our doorstep. So we do not have the infrastructure and systems in place to deal with a climate crisis in the same way that we didn't have them adequately in place when COVID-19 arrived here. So if you're angry at the Trump administration for killing our epidemic response systems, you should be, I think. And I think you should also be angry that they have defunded scientific research, environmental protections, and rolled back some of the pretty limited progress that we actually had started to make in the US as a transition away from fossil fuels, while meanwhile reallocating a bunch of FEMA resources to Trump's pet projects. So frankly, I think we should all be pissed off at every recent administration for their various roles that they've played in not taking climate seriously enough, but also, interestingly enough, in building up the US military to the point that our military is actually the single largest contributor of carbon emissions in the world. And so rather than building up our green infrastructure and rather than putting policies in place that would have led to working class economic stability, every administration in recent memory has been much more focused on building up the military. So all that is kind of background to the thing that I want to highlight today, which is what our options are. So I think that a lot of folks know that I've endorsed Bernie Sanders' version of the Green New Deal, and also have offered a few additions or alterations to that plan. But the plan itself is an amazing document. It's I printed it out, and we actually did a podcast episode the day after Bernie released the Green New Deal, and we spent like an hour talking about it, and it's about 32 pages long. It's a pretty significant text, and I really want to encourage people to read it, read the whole thing, but read it not so much through the eyes of, oh, this is this really extravagant environmental program, but I really want people to read it with an eye toward the picture that it paints of the world that could be created if we fully implemented Bernie's vision of the Green New Deal. So that world would include a number of really important things. I mean, number one is that we would have a world that would be significantly more just than the world that we have right now. It would be more equitable. A number of marginalized populations, both within the United States and internationally, would have, significant better situations in terms of justice, in terms of their economic stability and well-being, in terms of their human rights. People would have an easier time paying their bills because we would have millions of not just new jobs, but good paying union jobs. There's a lot of emphasis in Bernie's plan on unions and on public infrastructure and public ownership. We'd no longer have discrepancies in access to broadband internet based on your location or your economic status. And, if you've been dealing with this COVID-19 crisis and suddenly trying to work from home with an inadequate broadband connection, you understand why this would be important. Asthma rates would be dropping off sharply very quickly, and that opening picture of Los Angeles is a sort of visual demonstration of why that's true. Indigenous people would have restored tribal sovereignty and a serious voice at the table in terms of what our climate response is. There'd be more trees and gardens around us, and there'd be more public lands with expanded opportunities for recreation and hunting and fishing. And most importantly of all, in some ways, the weather would start to slowly stabilize again. We're in for a rough period of time regardless, because it's going to take some time for some of those changes to start affecting the actual systems that are out there in the environment right now. The climate has a very large, what they call flywheel, which means that once it gets momentum going, it's very difficult to slow it down and actually reverse it. So no one is promising, and they shouldn't be promising, that if we implemented the Green New Deal, suddenly climate disruption would just stop. Like, that's not actually how it works. It took us many decades to get to the point that we're at right now, many of them knowing that we were doing it. My first exposure to the climate disruption crisis was actually in 1987 on the front cover of Time magazine. And so it's been, well over 30 years that we have been aware of what we were doing, and it's been out there in public consciousness, and we haven't done it. And so it's not going to stop immediately, but I think it's important that we take those steps as quickly as we can. So Bernie's plan actually is very similar to the policy platform and the kind of world building that I was doing back in 2017 in my book called Together Resilient: Building Community in the Age of Climate Disruption. And the focus of that book is on locally self-governed responses to the crisis, where communities would have a significant say in what their lives look like. And the emphasis is much more on taking care of each other and the planet than continuing the kind of capitalist speeding train toward fast ecological destruction that we are all currently on. I actually got chills reading Bernie's plan for the first time. And it's not just because it has overlap with the stuff that I was talking about a few years back, but because it really opens the door for a scaled up version of the things that I was talking about, where we would have a much more compassionate and ecologically sound life that would benefit everybody. So please read Bernie's plan. It covers obvious things like creating national and regional high-speed rail, moving us from fossil fuels to renewables, and less obvious things like upgrading the housing stock and investment in rural broadband systems. And it covers agriculture and economic justice. It addresses the lead water crisis and makes sure that people with disabilities are fully included in all of the different infrastructure upgrades that the plan is talking about. So Bernie's plan also addresses one of the issues that I've been hearing from folks in our smaller communities here in Wyoming, where agricultural infrastructure has been severely neglected with disastrous effects on our farmers, including some major water infrastructure issues last summer on the east side of the state that ended up costing farmers in the state millions of dollars in, damage to their farms, and, as well as the stress of losing crops and, and not being able to actually complete their annual farming season. So that's what's in Bernie's plan. I want to say a couple things, if you do go ahead and read it, that are things that I'm actually looking at adding to the plan. So my additions on top of what Bernie has in his plan, so there's 4 of them. One of them is a massive reallocation of military personnel to vastly reduce our carbon emissions. So remember, I had said that the US military is the largest single contributor of CO2 emissions in the world. And so we want to actually pull back on that and look at taking seriously what military leadership has been recognizing for years, which is that climate disruption is actually a very real threat to our safety and well-being. And so I would actually go further than Bernie does in his plan in heeding that wisdom and bring our well-trained, well-coordinated military personnel home to actually be fighting sort of the biggest enemy that we have right now, which is climate disruption. And so my recommendation is to be bringing folks home and putting them to work on infrastructure development needs. And a side bonus of that would be considerably less PTSD for enlisted military members. The other thing that will happen as part of Bernie's plan, if we do that kind of reallocation, is moving entry-level enlisted military personnel wages up to a living wage. So currently, the entry level for enlisted personnel in the military doesn't even get paid federal minimum wage. And so this is one of the ways that like the federal government is actually directly violating its own rules in relation to military personnel. So that's the first thing I would add. The second thing is a grant program of $100 million a year in funding for grassroots, democratically led community projects. So these projects would need to have economic and racial justice priorities built into them, and they would need to be collectively owned. And if that's like a housing project, that could be land trust ownership. If that's a business project, that would be a worker-owned cooperative, but somehow having it be collectively owned and democratically run. And I include this because communities like the one that I used to live in Missouri are actually some of the very few places where Americans are living high quality, economically affordable lives with far reduced carbon footprints. And I'm very supportive of non-governmental responses to this crisis. That had been the work that I'd been involved with for decades before I made the decision to run for office. And making projects like this much more economically viable would be a good way to have dispersed, locally self-determined, locally self-government efforts happening nationwide, where people actually get to lean into their own passion and be leading with that. So the third thing that I would add, and this is, particularly for rural states like Wyoming, Bernie's looking at creating a smart grid, which makes a ton of sense in a lot of places around the country. And it is still like a massive infrastructure project that is all tied together. And one of the things that I've noticed as I've been driving around Wyoming and doing campaigning is that I will sometimes be driving for hours and there's electrical wires running next to me the entire time. And the towns that those electrical wires are serving are very few and far between. So I'm interested in actually having us focus in more rural areas on microgrids. And what that would mean is that there would be electricity would be generated very close to where it's being used. There's a thing called line loss that happens when you transfer electricity from a place where it's produced out to wherever it is that's being used. And we actually lose a lot of efficiency in systems because of that, which is why microgrids make way more sense for rural areas. So, in our smallest towns, the smallest town in Wyoming that's actually an incorporated town has a population of 4 people. They'd have a microgrid. And then in the larger places like Cheyenne and Casper, if one section of the grid went down, people would be within walking distance of other still viable electricity sources. So there might be 200 households that would be tied together in a microgrid. And our small towns, the other advantage of this is that our small towns would no longer be the last to get power restored. Typically the more rural you are, the more at effect you are when the grid goes down. You're often the last people to get your power turned back on. And those grids would be controlled much more locally, could be fixed much more locally, and it would just generally be a much more resilient way to set up our systems. The other thing that would allow us is another thread that runs through Bernie's plan and runs through a lot of my plans is public ownership and worker ownership. And going to a microgrid system in places like Wyoming would give lots of opportunities to get that kind of shift established, where instead of being these massive corporations that are running things, they could be much more locally controlled, including economic control over our energy sources.
Virtual town hall.
So the last one that I would add is a thing that I'm calling the 10 billion tree initiative. So scientists have said that if we plant about 1 trillion trees worldwide, it will make a massive difference. So there's 2 ends to the equation as far as climate disruption goes. One is how much CO2 we're putting into the air, and the other one is how much CO2 we are drawing down out of the air. And this very tried and true technology called trees and other kinds of vegetation are actually the best way to be drawing carbon down. And so a lot of countries are actually way ahead of this. You see these great stories in like Thailand and India pretty regularly about these massive tree plantings that are happening where, you know, the country will plant like 1 million or 10 million trees over the course of a weekend. It's actually super inspiring. And so I'm suggesting that the United States take responsibility for at least 10 billion of those trillion trees. And that's a lot of trees to plant. So it's also a lot of jobs that come with that. So one last major point that I want to cover before we open it up to discussion is the how you will pay for it part of the conversation, which you know, we don't ask that when we bail big businesses out to the tune of $1.5 trillion. We don't ask that about the military, but Bernie has had to really justify how he would pay for his plans. And so the good news is that, that there have been several independent economic analyses that have been done, and it looks like the plan actually pays for itself over the course of about 15 years. So yes, it is definitely a massive upfront investment or reinvestment in some places when we're talking about things like our farm infrastructure. But we will see an increase in our tax base with millions of people making more money and being more financially secure in the process. The plan also eliminates fossil fuel subsidies and reduces military spending on fossil fuels. We will also have far fewer people on social safety net programs through this plan if it's fully implemented, which is another place where some of the savings is coming from. And paying for itself doesn't actually even include the massive savings that economists have estimated by us simply taking this crisis seriously. So FEMA expenditures would be less than they would otherwise need to be. Bankruptcies would go down as we experience far fewer businesses and personal lives being ruined by ecological disasters, just as a couple things to note. So one more thing, Bernie's climate plan has a number of really direct statements about moral leadership in it, as well as about racial and economic justice, including between nations. I think we need to be willing to acknowledge that the US is one of the countries with an outsized responsibility for getting us into the situation that we're in. And that's a hard thing to do and to talk about, particularly for many of us who have struggled ourselves financially. And, you know, being poor puts you in a position where it's hard to make good ecological choices. But here's the thing, climate disruption is actually a class issue as much as anything else. We have to be able to look at the real data. And one of the interesting things about that data to me is that there's a very strong correlation between wealth and high incomes and increasing carbon emissions. In other words, the more money you make, the more carbon emissions you tend to be contributing. So not only wealthy nations have more responsibility, but wealthy individuals do as well. And I stand with working class and poor people all over the world and asking for significant economic reform as part of a climate plan. We need for wealthy investors to, the need that we've had for wealthy investors to keep building their wealth as one of the underlying driving forces of our economy is also one of the driving forces behind climate disruption. So when I call for us moving toward worker ownership as part of this, that call is significant because worker co-ops eliminate investor and huge CEO salaries, which are a huge push for us to produce more and sell more, and it leads to people consuming more. So this is a moment when I think we should be rethinking our economic system at its most fundamental level. And just like the COVID-19 crisis is showing us a lot about who is essential in our economy and who isn't, it is also giving us a chance to see ourselves as creative reinventors of our lives. And I'm focusing on climate now in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, in part because it parallels the needs to respond. The parallel needs to respond are actually very strong between these two crises and very closely connected to each other. Okay, so that was the stuff that I wanted to put out as the talking points. And I want to open it up now and invite if folks have questions or want to have conversations, either about particular things that I've said or if you've read Bernie's plan. I don't have it memorized, but I do have it up on my computer and we can look at it together if folks want to take a look at any more of those details. So thank you for being here. And who's got something you want to talk about?
You want to go, Glenn?
Yeah, sure. No, I'll just a few quick points just on stuff that's come up even this week. I love Bernie's plan and I love your alterations to it, Yana, especially the 10 billion train initiative. I think that's really exciting. But even in the midst of this pandemic, which is affecting people's breathing, we're seeing Trump roll back Obama era clean car rules, right?
Right.
So what can we do? The Green New Deal is fantastic, but this is very much something that we're going to work on when we're in office, right? When we have the power. What can we do outside of that? Because Trump has consistently attacked the environment in every way he can. And the fact that he's continuing to do it up until literally this Tuesday speaks volumes. And the fact that he, any mention of a Green New Deal or environmental policies in a coronavirus stimulus package is being vetoed by him. Mm-hmm. How can we incorporate these ideas under a Republican administration?
Yeah, that's a great question, Glenn. And the place that has been like the consistently hopeful thread for me during the whole Trump administration has been watching court responses. And a lot of court decisions were already, or court cases were already entrained before Trump became president, but we've seen a number of them come out where, like, I don't know if folks are familiar with, there was a group of young people who actually sued the federal government, and there's been a number of things that have happened in the course of that and other court cases where there is now such a thing as a climate defense. So it used to be that you couldn't bring up the science of climate in court cases, and that has actually shifted now, and you actually can bring it up, and people are being able to get away with intense civil disobedience, and the courts actually have their backs because it's now a viable defense. Now we're also seeing states that have used the COVID crisis to actually get through more pipeline activism bans, where it's actually like a felony now to do any kind of, like, even online rabble rousing around pipelines can get you into trouble now in some states. And so it's not all good news on the courts front, but I think those organizations that are kind of leading the way with court responses, I think that's a place to put some energy and some support. There's a number of nonprofits that you can reach out and support. The Western, it's not Western Wildlands, what's the, that Eric Mulvar is the head of. So the Western Watersheds Project. Anyway, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but we have some really good organizations in Wyoming that are actually working on those fronts. And so I think supporting those organizations is a great thing. I also think, hey, Stacy, is that your puppers? Stacy's puppy has a question. And, I think there's also a lot of good local responses that are happening. We have an organization in Laramie that has gotten through the city council, plans to actually have Laramie become a carbon neutral city. And so I think, when the federal government is going off the rails the way that it is right now, I mean, in addition to obviously voting and like getting people in there that are going to be actively resisting it on that front, I think leaning as much as we can into local and state responses is probably a really good place to be working right now.
Okay, sorry about the dog bark.
That's okay. That's okay, Stacey.
Periodically around here, they're drumming up. Okay. I was thinking the other day about some sort of governmental response at the federal level and the local level as to assistance and encouragement of corporations for putting in environmental responsible actions. I see a lot of corporations doing environmentally sound practices, but I would really like to see a clearinghouse somehow where those are brought to the forth, explained, and then maybe even funding along those ideas and those lines for other corporations who might want to try that without,
Mm-hmm.
so they may be losing a bit as far as destruction of the environment from what they do. And I'm not talking about cap and trade here exactly, but what about some new innovations that the projects of the products that are already being sold?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. One of the things that that I think that would need to include is some sort of like third-party assessment. There's just so much that corporations make claims about that actually ends up being greenwashing, where it's like, they say they're doing a good thing, and it's like it's not really that good of a thing when you sort of trace it back, or we are shoving our ecological impacts oftentimes off to other countries like poorer nations. Like there's a lot of stuff that corporations have participated in that basically moves our effects off, onto other places. And so we want to really be watching those sort of like economic and racial justice issues that can end up cropping up in terms of international trade. That said, I think if those things were in place, that could actually be a really interesting initiative to be doing. And I think we also, one of the things that was really interesting to me when I started looking into things in a little more detail about a decade ago was that we actually have all the tech we need to be able to solve this crisis. It's not a tech problem or an innovation problem at this point. It really is a political will and a funding issue as much as anything else. And so, yes, keep doing the innovating, and yes, let's make sure we're documenting that and sharing good ideas out there. And I think a lot of people have sort of been like putting their emotional and hope eggs into like baskets that are already perfectly full of things. It's like they're waiting for like the miracle tech to come along, and it's like we actually have a whole bunch of miracle tech already. And frankly, trees are part of the miracle fix to this whole thing. I mean, it's part of why I want to see us emphasize sustainable agriculture more and see us emphasize like agroforestry and that kind of stuff as well, because that's actually a heavily underused thing that it's like, you don't need any like technical know-how to be able to do that, and nobody has to innovate that. We just need to get out there and be, planting and using the sort of techniques that we already have. And there's also a lot of like indigenous culture stuff that can be drawn on that, that is frankly overlooked when we start having tech conversations. We tend to be thinking like high tech, modernized gadgetry kinds of things, rather than looking at what are the sustainable systems that have been around for many, many, many generations that we can be pulling on. So I think it's got to be a both and situation that we're, really leaning into.
Yeah, I have something I'm going to put in chat. But
Great.
I would really like to encourage corporations, I think, through these initiatives, like you said, when these regulations go into effect, that they just don't move everything to overseas.
Mm-hmm.
That can still be kept here, and there's at least some compromise.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Good. Go ahead and let's see.
But this is addressing the climate crisis, infusing tribal culture into climate science education.
Nice.
This is in the Journal of American Indian Higher Education. Perhaps you've seen that, but I have more than that. I've been looking at what the First Nations universities and community colleges especially are doing toward economic growth on the reservations and for their own people in the area of clean energy. And I know we're all looking at that, but some of these journals where you start, it's amazing. There are some specific names, and what I'm seeing is the First Nations education is really focusing on STEM, and that is getting their kids educated in clean energy, but then also getting them into engineering positions and clean jobs right on the reservations as these companies begin to develop. And I think it's very well done.
Mm-hmm. Great. Stacey, to Chris, we had put together that list of resources related to COVID-19 stuff. Maybe we should do another one related to innovative climate stuff, and actually go ahead, and both of those could get linked onto the website in addition to being on the Facebook. We can only pin one thing at a time on the Facebook page, and I want to leave the COVID resources up there, but it would be good actually to have a parallel document, and that, and you've been so helpful with like pulling together the COVID resources, and I know you're really good at finding these nuggets, and so it'd be great to get them actually available for folks as well. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Now, I just got this book, and this would be for anyone who's interested. But in fact, it dropped day before yesterday. It's first day out for this book, and it's called "As Long as Grass Grows: The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock." And I just started reading it, and it's incredible. It really is the definition of what environmental justice is, based on all of the environmental justice activism of First Nations that's been going on. And again, these are the things we don't hear about.
Great.
There are some incredible movements there. And then I have one more thing, I think. And this one, I just saw this morning, and I'm going to go back and read Bernie's stuff. In relation, I'm going to read all of that in relation to Indigenous First Nations, and what I'm giving you. Those are my connections, because what I do as I travel, and I travel a lot, and I visit Indigenous people, but we talk about the environment a lot on my road trips, my travels. That's what I do. This one I like, because this is the fossil-dependent communities included in Environmental Justice Bill. So, and this is HR 5986. It dropped in the Committee on Natural Resources on February 27th. And so there's some action going forth that's being sponsored toward supporting the poor people in all this.
That's great, Stacy. And yeah, when you actually do go ahead and read through Bernie's proposal, I think you'll see there's a lot of places where he's really holding the racial and economic justice issues, and particularly names Indigenous and tribal communities in his proposal repeatedly, which was one of the things that like gave me chills as I was reading it, is like he's really taking that seriously and making sure that, you know, the people who have been, you know, on the front lines of this for a really long time. Like, I don't know if folks know the statistics, but on average, one person a week dies protesting environmental issues, and most of them are fossil fuel related. And something like 60% of those people are Indigenous people. And so it's like, this is really the community that has been on the front lines, protecting all of us for a very long time and putting their own lives at risk. And so to see those communities named repeatedly in Bernie's Green New Deal was like one of the things that got me to go like, oh, this is the plan that I want to be supporting.
Yes. Well, in part, you know, what it means by fossil fuel dependent communities is not only that, it's that a lot of the First Nations reservations, their economy comes from digging coal. Yet they're burning it in the same fuel, in the same power plants that are polluting their valleys. So it blows right back in there. So the idea of helping them out, if we're going to replace coal and those other things, then there's some fear there as to their oil and gas and coal. You know, they're going to be left out. They're going to starve to death because they will have nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I heard down in Navajo country last time I was there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's critically important for folks to not be looking at this stuff as environmental legislation, but recognizing that it is as much about jobs creation, it is much about justice and reparations in some, you know, indirect ways as well. Like really looking at like, where are those communities that have been most damaged, and how can we particularly lean into that? And so, you know, as we're looking at these policies, I think it's really important to not just be thinking of it in terms of like ecological impacts, but also looking at, you know, how do we solve this crisis in a way that is really economically just, and and is taking into account the economy in parallel with. It's not like it was, when I was first doing environmental activism, there were all these ways that, like, we were talking about, like, spotted owls versus the lumber industry, and like they were really pitted against each other in terms of a lot of the early dialogues and narratives around this. And I think that is exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing right now. We need to recognize that really doing things that are good for addressing climate disruption, the things that actually do that are also economic justice initiatives in some really significant ways. And and that we can't ignore race in this whole thing. And so I'm happy to see that the dialogues have changed so significantly.
Oh, and correct me, but this Environmental Justice for All Act, which is brand new, I've looked at all of the presentations as far as fossil fuels and whatnot, and I haven't seen a single one with the words environmental justice in it.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first one I've seen. Have you seen others?
Well, I definitely have seen other organizations talking about it. I mean, one of the spaces that I spent a lot of time in before I, stepped back from my volunteer work to be doing this campaign was the New Economy Coalition. And in that space, and I was part of the policy platform development team, for the first 6 or 8 months that team was actually operational. And that space is definitely all about the necessity of integration of those things. I'm going to look, this is the first that I've seen of the Justice for All Act. So I want to look into what's actually in this, but it's exciting to hear that this is actually, if it's got a number to it, then it's gotten at least partway through the process in the House. And so I'm looking forward to looking into it and seeing what's there. But I do know there's a lot of organizations.
For today, I was going to find out who the sponsors were and where they were located. So I didn't get there, but that's
I bet it's not Liz Cheney. That's what I'm going to bet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the indigenous people stand in the way of Western expansion, so almost.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I know.
So,
with the environmental organization that I'm part of, as far as the environmental justice piece, trying to teach people what environmental justice is to begin with. I mean, it is a lobby organization for cutting emissions, but the environmental justice piece has been really left out, and it's struggling because of that. And that's too bad, because it's something we need to do, but if it's going to struggle because we can't bring everyone in on this, that's too bad. That's not good. And I know people don't feel that way. They just need to understand what environmental justice is.
Cool.
That's my opinion anyway.
Okay, great. Well, does anybody else want to hop in here? We're going to wrap this up in a few more minutes. I have a Democratic Socialists of America meeting in about 10 minutes, and so I'm going to hop off and get ready for that. But wanted to see if anybody else had anything you want to add before we wrap up.
You are going to post this pretty soon, so we'll be able to review it.
Yep. It's it'll need to have a little bit of time to get the recording downloaded and whatnot. But then yes, this will be up on the Facebook page later this afternoon.
Great platform. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
yes.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So looking forward to Thursday. So I've been doing 2 sessions each week online, one with these town hall sessions where we get a chance to have a conversation, and once on Thursdays at 12:30 Mountain Time. And this Thursday, we're going to have our usual state COVID-19 update that I've been doing. And then I'm also going to be taking up police violence in Wyoming on the heels of yet another fatal police shooting this past week. And also take a look at the state suicide epidemic and what those 2 crises have in common. So tune in Facebook Live, not on Zoom here, but on Facebook Live at 12:30 on Thursdays to talk about police violence and the suicide epidemic in Wyoming. And then we'll be back here next week with another topic. If you have a topic you want me to take up, please send a note to my campaign and let me know what you want us to be talking about in our town halls. So thank you, everybody. I'm Yana Ludwig, running for United States Senate in the state of Wyoming, and I am very happy to get a chance to talk to voters each week here on our virtual town halls. Thanks, everybody.